Someone who walks 30 minutes to work, cycles to run errands, and goes for a hike on the weekend burns significantly more calories than someone who drives everywhere but makes it to one intense gym session. Research on Nordic fitness culture puts it that directly. There is a Swedish word for what produces that outcome: Vardagsmotion. It translates roughly as everyday movement. And it is the specific concept that explains why gym membership rates in Scandinavia sit well below those in the US and UK, despite Nordic populations consistently scoring better on virtually every physical health metric. 10 specific things Nordic households do instead of, or rather than depending on, going to the gym. If this is the kind of video you are here for, subscribing costs nothing and keeps this content coming. So let us start with the most literal version of Vardagsmotion, and the one that produces the most movement per week for the average Nordic adult: walking or cycling to work instead of driving. This is covered in more depth in the cycling video on this channel specifically about Copenhagen, but the general principle applies across the whole region and deserves its own place here. A 30-minute walk each way to work, 5 days per week, produces 5 hours of moderate-intensity cardiovascular activity without ever requiring a separate decision to exercise. The movement happens because the commute has to happen regardless. Multiplied across a working year, this represents more total movement than most gym memberships actually produce in practice, given that gym attendance tends to be considerably less consistent than the commute it would need to match. There is a specific psychological mechanism at work here that is worth naming, because it explains why embedded movement outperforms scheduled exercise for most people over long time horizons. A gym membership requires a decision every single time it is used: whether to go, when to go, how long to stay, what to do once there. A walking or cycling commute requires none of those decisions, because the commute is already happening, and movement is simply how it gets done. Removing the decision removes the opportunity for motivation to fail, which is why habits embedded in unavoidable daily tasks sustain in ways that discretionary exercise habits frequently do not. Moving to the second habit, and this one sounds almost too obvious to include until you actually count how often the alternative is chosen: taking the stairs instead of the elevator, every time. This is the smallest item on this list and one of the most consistently effective habits in public health research on incidental activity. A person who takes the stairs in every building they enter for a full year accumulates a meaningful additional metabolic load with zero additional time cost, since stair climbing at normal pace often takes less time than waiting for an elevator. Nordic building culture tends to make stairs the obvious choice rather than the fallback, through design decisions, placement, and a general cultural default toward the active option that doesn't require any individual decision-making to sustain. For the third habit, we are looking at something covered briefly in the Weekend Habits video but worth its own full discussion here: going outdoors for movement rather than to a facility. Research published in Environmental Science and Technology found that outdoor exercise produces significantly larger reductions in tension, anger, and depression compared to the same activity performed indoors, at matched duration and intensity. The specific mechanisms involve both exposure to natural light, which regulates the cortisol and melatonin cycles covered in the morning and sleep videos on this channel, and the restorative effect of natural environments on directed attention, covered in attention restoration theory. A walk in a forest, a run along a coastline, a cycle through open countryside, each of these is doing something a treadmill in a gym cannot replicate, regardless of how long the session lasts or how many calories it burns. There is a practical dimension to this outdoor preference worth naming too, because it connects to the economics of movement in a way that gym membership doesn't. A gym membership costs money every month whether or not it is used. Walking outdoors, cycling on a bike already owned, swimming in a lake accessible through the right to roam, all of these cost essentially nothing per session once the basic equipment is in place. Nordic countries have invested heavily in the outdoor infrastructure that makes this possible: well-maintained trails, cycling paths, maintained winter skiing tracks. But the individual cost per session of using that infrastructure is close to zero, which removes one of the most common barriers to consistent exercise across a lifetime. The fourth habit is one that most cultures treat as either leisure or a chore, but Nordic culture treats as movement. Gardening and yard work. Tending a garden, raking leaves, splitting firewood, clearing snow. These are sustained, low to moderate intensity physical activities that engage the whole body, produce visible results, and happen outdoors. Swedish research on Vardagsmotion specifically lists gardening and household maintenance tasks as core components of the everyday movement pattern. The specific value of this category, beyond the physical activity itself, is that it combines movement with a tangible outcome. The garden looks better, the firewood is ready for winter, the yard is clear. This completion-based satisfaction is the same mechanism covered in the stressed videos section on handwork, and it produces a different psychological experience than exercise performed purely for its own physical benefit. Nordic gardening culture is worth noting specifically because it goes well beyond the kitchen garden or the weekend hobby. Allotment culture across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway gives urban residents access to plots of land for growing food and spending time outdoors, a tradition that goes back over a century and remains extremely popular. A summer afternoon in an allotment garden, digging, planting, harvesting, is sustained moderate-intensity physical activity that produces food, outdoor time, sunlight exposure, and the particular satisfaction of work, with a visible result, all simultaneously, and without any of them requiring the label of exercise. Point 5 is where the concept of Vardagsmotion becomes most visible as a deliberate philosophy rather than just a collection of habits. Running errands on foot or by bike rather than by car, every trip to the pharmacy, the post office, the bakery, the market, is a potential movement opportunity that most car-centric cultures convert into a sedentary experience. Nordic city design, with its density, walkability, and cycling infrastructure, makes the active option actually competitive with driving on time, which removes the practical justification for the car on short trips. The cumulative movement this produces across a week, several 15-minute round trips on foot or bike, often exceeds what a single gym session would have produced, distributed across the week, rather than concentrated in 1 hour. For the sixth habit, I should mention briefly that I built the Scandinavian reset around exactly this kind of integrated movement thinking, and the daily structure module inside it covers how to build Vardagsmotion into your own routine. It is in the pinned comment or directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop. The sixth habit itself is one that Nordic children are introduced to early and most adults never entirely lose: playing outside without a specific purpose or structured activity. The Norwegian and Swedish tradition of friluftsliv, open-air life, doesn't distinguish sharply between adult and child versions of outdoor time. Adults who grew up spending afternoons outside continue spending afternoons outside, in different forms, winter and summer, a walk after dinner, an hour in the garden, a Saturday in the woods. None of these are structured exercise. None of them are scheduled as fitness activities. They are simply the form that free time takes in a culture where outdoors is the default rather than the exception. The seventh habit is one that connects the physical activity dimension of this video to the social dimension covered in the stressed and weekend habits videos. Swimming, particularly in natural water. Open water swimming, lake swimming, and sea swimming are all more common across the Nordic region than in most comparable wealthy countries, and they persist year-round in a way that surprises visitors. Cold water swimming, which overlaps with the cold exposure content in the anti-aging and stressed videos, combines cardiovascular activity with temperature regulation benefits in a single session. The specific reason this belongs on a movement instead of gym list is that it requires nothing but access to water, which across the Nordic region is covered by allemannsretten, the right to access open water covered in the Right to Roam video on this channel. For the eighth habit, we are looking at something that specifically targets the most sedentary part of most modern days: standing up and moving during the workday rather than sitting for unbroken hours. The research on sedentary behavior is increasingly clear that the total hours spent sitting is an independent health risk factor separate from exercise. A person who exercises intensely for 1 hour and then sits for 14 hours may have worse metabolic outcomes than one who never formally exercises, but rarely sits for more than an hour without brief movement. Nordic workplace culture has absorbed this finding through a combination of standing desk use, short walking meetings, and the deeply ingrained habit of the proper lunch break covered in the Daily Habits video, which gets people away from their desks in the middle of the day rather than eating while seated at a screen. The specific research that has driven awareness of sedentary time as an independent risk factor in Nordic countries comes largely from Scandinavian occupational health research itself, which has historically been among the most rigorous in the world on workplace well-being. The finding that total sedentary time matters independently of exercise, meaning someone who exercises for an hour but sits for 13 more, is not as well protected as someone who moves more consistently throughout the entire day, is now embedded in Nordic workplace design in a way it hasn't yet fully reached most other workplace cultures. Point 9 is one that produces the most movement in the shortest time and is the most specific to the Nordic winter. Cross-country skiing. In Norway, Sweden, and Finland, cross-country skiing is not a specialist activity requiring resort access or expensive lift tickets. It is a form of transportation and leisure available to anyone with snow on the ground and a pair of skis, which in much of the region means several months of the year. Research consistently identifies cross-country skiing as one of the highest calorie expenditure aerobic activities measurable, demanding more from the cardiovascular system per minute than most gym-based activities while happening entirely outdoors in natural environments. Nordic children learn this before they learn to ride a bike. Many Nordic adults do it on weekend mornings, the way people in other cultures might drive to a gym class. And for the 10th and final habit, the one that ties everything on this list together into a single coherent practice, treating movement as the default rather than the exception. Every item on this list is an expression of the same underlying approach. The body was meant to move throughout the day, and the goal is to structure daily life so that movement happens continuously rather than concentrating it into one scheduled hour. Vardagsmotion is not a workout plan. It is a design philosophy for how a day is structured. Walking to the shop instead of driving, stairs instead of elevator, garden in the afternoon, swimming at the weekend, ski to work in December. None of these require motivation in the sense that a gym habit requires motivation, because none of them are set apart from the rest of life as a separate, effortful category. They are simply what a Nordic day looks like when movement has been built into its structure from the beginning. 10 habits. And the single concept threading through all of them that is now worth naming directly. Vardagsmotion doesn't replace the gym for Nordic people because Nordic people decided gyms were bad. It replaces the gym because a day structured around movement never produced a gap that a gym was needed to fill. The gym is the solution to the problem of a sedentary life. Vardagsmotion is the alternative to having that problem in the first place. The transferable version of this insight, for someone living in a car-centric environment where many of these specific habits are structurally harder to maintain, is the underlying question rather than any specific activity. For every trip you are about to make, every task you are about to do, is there a version of this that involves movement rather than a version that doesn't? Sometimes the answer is no. The pharmacy is 10 miles away and it is raining, and you are carrying something heavy. But often the answer is yes, and the question was never asked because the car was the automatic default rather than one option among several. Vardagsmotion begins with that question, asked consistently, until the active option becomes the default, and the question stops needing to be asked consciously at all. All the sources and data referenced in this video are listed in the description below. If this changed how you think about movement, following the channel means a lot. Drop your next video idea in the comments. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.